out. I'm very thankful this is February 1st. I thought January was an extraordinarily long month, not just politically, but otherwise. So I want to talk today about, we'll shift the focus a little bit about away from what we talked about last week, which was about the insurrection, impeachment, that sort of thing. And I'm going to focus a little bit more on what we can expect in the first part of the Biden administration in terms of policy. So I'll talk a little bit about policy and about the things that may shape what President Biden can get done, along with the very narrow Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate. So again, as always, I welcome your comments, your questions, anything you have. If you want to put them in the chat, that's fine. If at the end of my 15 or 20 minutes of talking, you want to verbalize your comments, that's fine too. So anyway, let me go ahead and get started. Well, when we talk about 100 days in terms of a benchmark for presidential accomplishment, that really started with Franklin Roosevelt. And if you look at the little chart on the left, you see something interesting, which is President Roosevelt actually took office on March 9th. And so just for those of you who may not remember your high school history class, we changed the date of the presidential inauguration relatively recently. And so that has become the January 20th date that we all know and recognize now as part of a constitutional amendment. So President Roosevelt's first 100 days went from March 9th to June 16th, 1933. And he did a remarkable amount during that particular time. And so because he entered the White House in the midst of the Depression, and things were dreadful, obviously, he also had some pretty favorable legislators in Congress. So the fact that he was able to accomplish as much as he did in 100 days was in part because of the situation, but in part because he had people in Congress who would enable him to carry out his agenda. So that's worth noting. So we talk about the first 100 days as being something magical, and it really is symbolic more than anything else. There's nothing in the Constitution that says the first 100 days is that important. In fact, for most modern presidents, the first 100 days is really kind of meaningless. But anyway, it's worth noting what more recent presidents have done in their first 100 days. And so this is just a graphic that shows what kinds of legislation that our four previous presidents did in their first 100 days. And you see that President Donald Trump was able to sign 29 laws. Now, these are actually laws passed by Congress, signed by the president. These are not executive orders or anything. I'll talk about that in just a minute. President Trump did a number of things in his first 100 days. You notice that the number of pages of those 29 laws was not very substantial. So a lot of the things that he did very early on were not the most substantial kinds of legislation that we have seen other presidents do. President Obama passed signed into law 14 bills, quite a bit longer in his first 100 days. The first bill was the Lilly Ledbetter Act, which gave women more equality in the workplace. Bush and Clinton, you see what they did in their first 100 days. But I think it's worth noting that if you compare Franklin Roosevelt to any one of these four presidents, he signed into law not only lots of things, but very substantial things. So again, it's none of these presidents compared to FDR in terms of 100 days. But again, my point is we put a little bit too much emphasis on that 100-day benchmark. What we see a lot more modern presidents doing, including President Biden, is using the executive order. And these are solely within the purview of the president to give orders to the different agencies on how to carry out existing laws. So President Biden, as of Friday, had signed 25 executive orders, actually as of his first week, last Wednesday. He's got more scheduled this week. And some of the ones that you might remember from last week, he did some things to strengthen Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act. He restored some things that President Trump had undercut in the Affordable Care Act. He'd done some things on racial justice, access to healthcare and climate change, executive order to put us back into the Paris Accords, for example. So these are important. Every president has used the executive order, and that graphic on the right shows you the 4 previous presidents in terms of what they have done in terms of executive orders. President Obama and President Trump have also used executive orders quite frequently. So President Biden has taken a very aggressive start to his presidency in terms of the first now almost 2 weeks in terms of executive orders. The question is, what will he do in terms of legislation, actual laws signing into or signing bills into laws? And I'll talk about that at the very end. But one of the issues that we need to recognize that differentiates FDR and even more recent presidents from Donald Trump or Joe Biden is the fact that they enter office with much more difficult. If you go back to 1952 and you see Dwight Eisenhower in his first 6 months in office had an average approval of about 71%. I mean, 71% of Americans approved of the work that Dwight Eisenhower was doing and only just under 10% disapproved. So he had a net of almost 61% positive approval ratings. So if you were to kind of look up that table, you see that it's much more frequent, much more likely that modern presidents don't have that positive approval rating that Eisenhower had or even FDR had. You look at Donald Trump, he never had a net approval rating in the positive way. But in his first 6 months, he had a -10 net approval rating. But even Obama did not have anywhere near, or Bill Clinton did not have anywhere near the kinds of approval ratings that earlier presidents had. And that really is the key to getting things done, and why I think Joe Biden's first 100 days will be substantial, but not necessarily FDR-like, or even Dwight Eisenhower-like, or Richard Nixon-like. It's just simply we're a much more polarized country, and Joe Biden, as I'll show you on the next slide, at least as of yesterday, had a approval rating of 54.3%. This is the aggregate of the polls, and a disapproval rating of just over a third. So he's doing obviously better in terms of his approval, but the fact that almost 1/3 of Americans and over half of Republicans already disapprove of his tenure in office means that it's going to be much more difficult than FDR or Dwight Eisenhower to get a lot of legislation passed in the first 100 days. All right, first thing Joe Biden is doing, other than executive orders, is cabinet confirmations. He's got a lot of cabinet and sub-cabinet things, people to approve by the Senate or get approved by the Senate. He has made some headway in terms of getting cabinet officials approved. The big keys in terms of national security, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, DNI, Director of National Intelligence, have all been approved. Others are in the pipeline. But I think it's worth noting that Joe Biden got a much later start than recent presidents in terms of getting his cabinet confirmation underway. Many recent presidents have had cabinet confirmation hearings before Inauguration Day. Joe Biden did not have. So he's still working on getting people through, and we'll see a number of people come through this week. One of the keys, I think, for Joe Biden is to get his economic and legal team in place, including Merrick Garland, the Attorney General nominee. That will probably be one of the latter cabinet confirmations that's done by the Senate. So that's kind of job one for Joe Biden. These folks being in place do help with the legislative agenda because of these folks will work with members of Congress to push the president's legislative agenda. So it's not unrelated to laws getting passed. If we look at what Joe Biden has promised on the campaign trail, he has got one of the most aggressive agendas of any president since FDR. I'm just going to sample a few of the things that he wants to get done through either executive order or legislative action. Again, this is just about just a smidgen of what he wants to get done. Starting with the pandemic, there are some things, and you see the blue check marks. Those are things that he has done through executive order, but some things he can't do through executive order. It's just much more difficult to make lasting or even substantive change through executive order. So some things with the pandemic he has already done, passing the national mask mandate. If you saw over the weekend, the TSA, the Transportation Agency, is going to enforce the mask mandate on airline flights, trains, and other transportation kind of things. So doing some things like that. But a very aggressive agenda, including trying to get more vaccine into the pipeline. In terms of the economy, not a lot can be done through executive order. He has done the Buy American provision through executive order, and that is helping or mandating that the federal purchasing of things give more precedent to American produced goods. That does not necessarily mean that the private sector is affected. But there's some other things that Joe Biden wants to do is roll back Donald Trump's tax cuts on corporations. That can't be done through executive order. That'll take legislation. He's going to have to address somewhat the budget situation. And he wants to raise taxes on the most wealthy in this country. That's going to be difficult, but he wants to limit that to people to not have taxes go up on people earning less than $400,000. Again, legislative action. He wants to spend about $700 billion to boost all kinds of manufacturing and research and development in a variety of fields. That's going to take legislative action. And the minimum wage, which is tucked into his COVID-19 plan, it's unlikely that's going to make it through the legislative process as is. And raising the national minimum wage is probably going to have to be a standalone piece of legislation. And again, it does take congressional approval to raise the federal minimum wage. And finally, on healthcare, and again, we could go and talk about any number of areas. Again, lots of things that Joe Biden wants to do in terms of healthcare. He wants to not only help with the pandemic, including opening 100 more public health centers, but he wants to pass a public option for healthcare, which is to kind of give people an option to private health insurance or Affordable Care Act types of policies. That is going to be a very heavy lift. Obviously, there are many Republicans in Congress that want to eliminate the Affordable Care Act. So public option would be very challenging. So, again, this is just a sampling of what Joe Biden wants to do. And again, this is more FDR-like in terms of the kinds of ways, and he wants to fundamentally transform the country. We could have energy here, foreign policy, very aggressive. But a lot of it's going to take legislative action. So the question is, if Joe Biden wants to do all this, how does he do it? Now, I have put a photograph of Jimmy Stewart. If you're fans of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, this is a black and white film from a long time ago. It was one of the first political films that I watched as a young person growing up. I was enamored with Jimmy Stewart, particularly the scene in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which he actually does an oral filibuster. when he spoke very movingly in that particular scene and really transformed Congress through that scene. But that's fiction. The filibuster still exists. And so the question for Joe Biden and Democrats is, in the Senate, will they keep the filibuster? The filibuster not done like Jimmy Stewart and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington as an oral or spoken filibuster, but the threat of a filibuster makes it so that it takes 60 votes to pass most legislation in the Senate. So the question is, from Joe Biden's perspective, does he want to either try to eliminate the filibuster or to use a process called reconciliation, which is a very cumbersome process, and try to get his legislative agenda done with just a majority of votes in the Senate? Or does he want to try compromise? And the first piece of legislation that I think will give us a real sign of what Joe Biden's approach to legislation is the COVID-19 relief. He proposed a $1.9 trillion plan, which includes lots of things, a $1,400 check or direct deposit to many Americans, help for state and local government, aid to help get public health moving on the vaccine, and even the $15 federal minimum wage. Republicans have countered this morning with a $618 billion plan, which does not include the federal minimum wage or help the state and local governments, and a smaller check to people, a limited number of people. So the question is, if Joe Biden really believes that he wants the $1.9 trillion program, he's got a very difficult task in front of him if he does not eliminate the filibuster or use what's called budget reconciliation. My guess is Joe Biden, because he is a creature of the Senate, a 38-year member of the US Senate, that he's going to not want to eliminate the filibuster. That seems to be opening, in his view, a can of worms. So here's what I predict, and I'll stop after this and let you talk and ask questions. I think Joe Biden will do three things in his first 100 days. And again, I am not a believer that he will push the Democrats to eliminate the filibuster. I think he will try to use compromise, try to use his personal relationships with Mitch McConnell and others to try to get the Senate to come along on some issues. I think we will see a COVID relief bill. I think it'll be closer to $1 trillion than $1.9 trillion. He will compromise, but not give in to Republicans on that. I think we'll see an infrastructure bill in which there'll be some public money that will go toward bridges, roads, ports, et cetera, but he'll try to figure out a way to do some private-public partnerships, which means the private sector will contribute. And I think there's increasing evidence that the third kind of bill that Joe Biden will push is something with electoral reform. Democrats have passed the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. They did that after Representative Lewis passed last year. It's been sitting on it's been sitting in the Senate for a while. I think Joe Biden will push for some kind of democratic reforms, including restoring some of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That's a pretty heavy lift for the first 100 days for the Biden administration. I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of more room in the first 100 days from a legislative perspective. If he can get COVID-19 relief, something moving on infrastructure, and something moving on voting rights, that's a pretty heavy legislative agenda, because we've still got the Senate trial starting next week for impeachment, and everything else that's going on. So anyway, that's what I've got for in terms of my presentation today, and I would love to hear your thoughts as to what you think Biden will do, what questions you may have about Joe Biden, and so I'll open the floor.
Do you mind if I just jump right in?
Sure.
I've always got a question. Uh,
Okay.
so my question is regarding the what it looks to be like almost like an identity crisis within the Republicans. It was kind of remaining to be seen once Trump left the stage. Would they continue to be this party of Trump versus, okay, well, we're going to kind of move on from him? And it's starting to look like there's almost like a war within what they think their identity. I'm wondering, how is that going to impact how they vote together, and that'll impact what Biden brings up and hopes to pass. Is that going to get in the way? Is it going to make it easier? What do you think?
Well, I think it is going to be a challenge, but I think one of the things that we need to recognize that it all hinges on the Senate. The House is its own creature and has, their own war going on. Liz Cheney, Marjorie Taylor Greene being totally opposite in the House. But remember, the Democrats still have an 8-seat majority in the House, and so they can pass things relatively easily. Yeah, there'll be some conflict. It all comes down to what happens in the Senate. This is where it's 50-50 with Kamala Harris being the deciding vote, but it's not really 50-50. We have some very moderate people in the Senate. It could go either way. Joe Manchin of West Virginia is going to be a key member of the US Senate, as are the two Democrats from Arizona. So the question to me is, despite the narrative of the Civil War being fought on the Republican side, remember the Democrats haven't always gotten along either. You have the very progressive side of the Democratic Party pushing Joe Biden. I'm talking about AOC and people like that pushing him to, try to eliminate the filibuster, shove through very progressive agenda items. The thing, Brian, to keep in mind is that despite the differences that Republicans have in the House and the Senate, they are looking forward to the next election in 2022. They will have fights, they will have primaries in 2022 between the Trump supporters and the non-Trump supporters. There's no question about it, but they can't not govern. And so Mitch McConnell is the minority leader and recognizes more so than anyone else that a completely chaotic fight between Republicans doesn't do them any good in trying to retake the House or get over that 50 Senate threshold in 2022. So I think practicality will rule, and they're not going to let, the very aggressive progressive agenda be shoved through without a real fight. So I'm sensitive to what's going on within the Republican circles, but I'm also sensitive to what's going on within Democratic circles. People aren't playing well together.
Thanks.
So do you think that there's too much I know there's been a lot of talk about student loan forgiveness programs. Do you think that there's really too much, that this would be like one of those high in the sky things that they could do? Or do you think they would actually be able to talk about student loan debt and the forgiveness aspect, or is there just too much?
Well, this is where, I think there are some very vocal people in the House and the Senate urging this, AOC and a number of people in the House, Senator Warren in the Senate. I mean, clearly Democrats have been concerned about this for a long time. But I think what told me that it's more pie in the sky than it is reality for Democrats was the appointment of Janet Yellen as the Secretary of Treasury. Janet Yellen is probably the most qualified person to be appointed Secretary of the Treasury, maybe ever. I mean, if you think about Janet Yellen's background, both at the Federal Reserve and in key economic positions, this is a woman who is got an eye on the ball. She is a Democrat. There's no question about that. But she's also looking at the bigger picture, which is, the deficit, the debt, as well as other legislative and economic issues. To me, had Bernie Sanders been appointed Secretary of Treasury, I'd have said, yeah, maybe that signals that Joe Biden's willing to fight for student loan debt. I just can't see it as being in a top 20 list for Joe Biden or Janet Yellen or even Chuck Schumer.
I'd like your comments on Madison Cawthorn, who has just rocketed to headlines and controversy, and he's 25 years old, but from this state. Already a petition out to remove him from office. I mean, I just, good grief. What are your thoughts?
Well, you know, I think I said, I forget, one of the sessions I've done post-election, I said that Madison Cawthorn is one of those people who was elected in 2020 that showed that Trumpism has got a very strong hold on North Carolina. The lieutenant governor is someone else who I believe is symbolic of Trumpism. Madison Cawthorn, if you remember the history of running in the 11th district, so Mark Meadows leaves the seat, Republicans start grooming a traditional Republican, a woman, to run for that seat. And then this 24-year-old kind of out of the blue decides to run for that seat, and in a primary against the traditional Republican candidate in the 11th district. He upsets her. He has less money, less name recognition, but yet wins the seat, wins the primary, and then goes on to win the general election. You know, 20 years ago, would that have been possible? No. I mean, he doesn't have any experience. His resume is very thin. It's basically, you know, a lot of bravado. I'll put it that way. Well, he wins the seat on bravado, and all of a sudden becomes this national phenomenon, speaking at all kinds of events, including the January 6th event. His claims about his own background have been disproven. So he's got a lot of issues, but he's also got tremendous support in the 11th congressional district. I'm one of those that don't think that the House is going to remove any members, including Cawthorn. I don't think it takes 2/3 of a vote of a chamber to remove a member. If I were rank ordering members of the House to be removed, he might be 3rd or 4th, but I don't even think Marjorie Taylor Greene is in real danger of being removed, which speaks a lot to the current House. You know, I think the chance for North Carolina to, I hate to put it this way, to have someone like Madison Cawthorn removed has a lot to do with redistricting this year. So we know that the North Carolina legislature, one of their tasks this year is to redraw the political maps, including congressional maps. We're going to get one more member of the House of Representatives, which means we'll have 14 members of the House of Representatives in the next election cycle. How they choose to draw the maps will say a lot about whether they want to keep, and this is the North Carolina legislature, this is not Congress. This will say a lot about whether they want to keep Madison Cawthorn or not. They could draw a map to make it virtually impossible for him to win the next election cycle. So I'm keeping my eyes on the Republicans in the North Carolina House and North Carolina Senate to find, are they willing to take steps to make him a one-term member of the House or not? I don't think the U.S. House of Representatives will remove him.
David, what do you think is going to happen at the House Republican Conference this week, specifically in regards to Liz Cheney? And what do you think about former President Bush coming out this past weekend and saying that, you know, wishing Dick Cheney happy birthday, but also acknowledging his, I mean, it was subtle, but it still was him acknowledging the work that she was doing within the Republican Party.
Yeah, I mean, you know, goes back to Brian's question. This is what, you know, You saw Matt Gaetz go out to Wyoming last week and do a rally against Liz Cheney in her own state. You see the different Republican state parties censuring their own Republican members, like in Arizona and places like that. It's, to me, I've not seen this in my lifetime. I've not seen parties be so against their own members. Liz Cheney she is not a lightweight by any stretch of the imagination. She can handle the Matt Gaetzes of the world. She can handle the, whoever else within the Republican caucus will speak out against her. The question that I have is, Mitch McConnell as Kevin McCarthy as minority leader in the House. He could do some things to make her life very challenging. They will not remove Liz Cheney by any stretch of the imagination. They may run somebody in the primary against Liz Cheney in Wyoming. But let's remember the history of the Cheneys in Wyoming. Dick Cheney represented Wyoming forever before he went to become George W. Bush's vice president. The Cheneys have got a long history in Wyoming, and they have got conservative bona fides. I think this is more a temporary sort of backlash against Liz Cheney. I think, President George W. Bush has become more outspoken in recent weeks than he has really at any time since he left the presidency. I think he's doing this for a friend, but I think Liz Cheney will survive.
Stays in House leadership.
Now that's what Kevin McCarthy, she could, because House leadership is done by vote. So, if enough members were to want to remove her as the number 3 House Republican, they could do that. But that's important, yes. But Liz Cheney, Kevin McCarthy, that's the decision he's got to make. Will he allow his caucus to basically re-vote on House leadership? He's in trouble himself. And so this visit he had with President Trump in Mar-a-Lago last week was trying to save his own political future. So I think McCarthy's got some real soul searching to do. He could help Liz Cheney, but he's got to first kind of solidify his own leadership.
Okay, we've got a question from Paula Heron. How does Biden plan to change the Supreme Court?
He's established a study group to look at the composition of not only the Supreme Court, but other federal courts. The idea is, unless there are some unexpected retirements, Clarence Thomas is rumored to be next, but Sam Alito, could retire. That's the traditional route, to just allow retirements to play themselves out. And it's not unlikely that Joe Biden's first term could have 1 or 2 replacement justices. They've got enough votes right now in the US Senate to confirm anyone that they would nominate. The question that's being posed is, would Joe Biden propose legislation, or would Democrats propose legislation to enlarge the Supreme Court and the other lower courts at the federal level? Joe Biden was asked that a lot on the campaign trail, and he was pretty coy in answering that question. I don't see it happening, just because I think Joe Biden, just like I said about the filibuster, I think he is an institutionalist, and he would much prefer following the traditional route. The Supreme Court has not, at least up to this point, been a complete disaster for Democrats. Just think about what the Gorsuch and even Kavanaugh nominations have done to protect things like LGBTQ employment rights. They did not allow these crazy election lawsuits to go forward. So, I think even though Democrats are concerned about the spring in the court on abortion rights and other things. I don't think unless anything dramatic happens that Joe Biden's going to push for 11 justices on the Supreme Court. That would be a very challenging fight.
Okay, from Lou Turner, why does Biden want to create more public health centers when existing public health departments are underfunded?
Well, I think it is in part, what you see in his $1.9 trillion COVID-19 relief package. I mean, he wants to get money out. I mean, 400 and some odd billion dollars out to existing public health. But I think what Biden and his public health team has talked about a lot is that there are places in the country where, there aren't public health facilities, in tribal nations. For example, if you've been following what's going on in the Navajo Nation during COVID-19, I mean, people are traveling hundreds of miles to even get a test. So I think what Biden is trying to do is fund the existing public health operations, but also expand it to give underserved communities more access.
Okay, and then we have someone that agrees with leaving the Supreme Court alone. When does packing the court stop? Please speak about Biden and immigration reform.
Okay. Well, I think you saw Joe Biden after he secured the election to the president, even before he was inaugurated, talk about he wants to do comprehensive immigration reform. And that means potentially giving a pathway to citizenship for DACA recipients, the millions of people who came here as young people who have protected status, but also the other undocumented people here. Just remember that it was less than 10 years ago where there were Republicans, including Marco Rubio in the Senate, who were pushing for the same thing. And so what Joe Biden would like to do with the support of many pro-business advocacy organizations is to stop the amount of money and time used to find and deport undocumented people that have no criminal background. Is it possible for Joe Biden to get this kind of immigration reform bill done? Again, with traditional rules operating in the Senate, he would need to get 60 votes. Can he get essentially 10 Republican senators to come on board, assuming all Democrats would support a bill like that? That's the question. I can easily see that, some Republicans would be open to this, whether Rubio would, because he has his own 2022 election problems, namely Ivanka Trump to contend with. But at least, Biden is sort of resurrecting an idea that started under President Reagan, was continued under Presidents Bush and Obama, and only during the Trump administration has that been just sort of completely shelved. So I think there is some opportunity to do comprehensive immigration reform. But, it's as President Obama, who came into office pushing a similar kind of bill, he deviated from that and went for healthcare first. My question is, after COVID-19, once we get some bill through the Congress and signed by President Biden, what the second piece of legislation that he gets behind? I don't feel like it's going to be immigration reform necessarily, because I think infrastructure and voting rights will be next. But, if we see Joe Biden take on the mantle of immigration reform next, it's possible.
Okay, you just mentioned infrastructure, and we actually have a question about that. So that was perfect timing.
Okay.
There's been no increase in the federal gas tax since 1993. This tax has historically been used to fund infrastructure. Will Biden and Congress support an increase in the gas tax, or what methods will be used to fund infrastructure?
That's the real challenge, because not only has the tax rate not gone up, but because of all kinds of things, electric cars, hybrid cars, et cetera. The money coming into the transportation fund has been declining for a number of years. The pandemic obviously affected that. So the question is, how do you pay for, I mean, most transportation experts will say this is a $2 trillion plus need out there. Because we talk about our own bridges and roads, and if any of you have been on I-95 going north or south, you recognize, the tremendous needs out there. There's not that kind of money in the Federal Highway Transportation Fund, and nowhere close. So the question is, do you try to fix the existing system, which would be looking at increases in the per gallon federal gasoline tax, which could mean, very substantial changes to that. I think it's 37.5 cents per gallon is the current. Or do you switch to a usage tax, which a number of people have been pushing? So for people who drive electric cars, there would be some kind of per mileage fee or just a flat rate applied to them. So I don't know the answer to what Biden administration will push, but clearly if there is a major infrastructure bill, we've got to look at the funding side. And that may be looking at some kind of change to the way in which the highway fund is filled, or it could be a completely different kind of usage tax. Or what I think is more likely, and you're seeing this in some states around the country, is that public-private partnerships, that private companies come in and do the initial funding of even roads. We see that in lots of places. And then the general revenue or the highway fund pays that back over the course of 20 or 30 years. So, it's $2 trillion plus of spending. Where we get that money, there are a lot of options.
With Trump gone, do you think elected Republicans will have the courage to break with the Republican Party on issues that are best for the people within their state and not just what is best for Republicans as a whole? Tillis was not a Trump fan, but bent to the pressure of the Trump White House.
I think, my personal view is that, there are certain members of Congress who are very much in line with former President Trump. There are others who are sort of waiting for the fever to break from a lot of, the Trump support. Tom Tillis is an interesting person in that he's got till 2026 before he runs again. And so, the pressure is off a little bit in terms of being primaried on the Republican side. But, he's one of the 10 Republicans who's meeting with Joe Biden today to talk about the $618 or $619 billion COVID-19 relief package. So he's supporting a much lower amount being spent on COVID-19. The question is, I don't mean to insult anybody, but I didn't think that Trumpism is really about policy. I think what you'll see is, Tom Tillis is a conservative Republican. He has his moderate moments, but he is by and large, if you go back to even his time in the US, in the North Carolina legislature, he supported a lot of very conservative things. So I don't think that we should expect Tom Tillis to, on major policy, to break with the Republican caucus. I don't also think if the impeachment vote happens in the US Senate, I think he's going to vote to acquit. But again, I think he is, the question to me about, Trumpism and its policy is, will the Republicans revert to more kind of free market economics? We've seen, tariffs placed on European countries, Canada, China, et cetera. And that was a Trump thing. And the results have been very mixed, if not negative. It's cost Americans jobs. And so, will Republicans kind of revert back to those kind of issues. I think they will.
So David, yesterday you saw Adam Kinzinger announce his PAC. One of the things that I thought was interesting on Meet the Press is Chuck Todd even said there were supposed to be other Republicans that were going to appear with you, and they did not. So he spoke out on his own on Meet the Press. So there is a sense that they're afraid of the backlash that they're going to suffer of trying to reclaim their party. I mean, and I think we've even seen it with Fox News too. So part of me thinks, is it you're listening to what Fox News is now putting out over A, your constituents, or B, just, I mean, you can't get into being a party of conspiracies. I mean, that's just, that's not going to last, right?
You would think not. I think, you know, it's interesting. Nancy Pelosi is getting ready to put in what's called a supplemental bill of really tens of millions of dollars to provide additional security for members of Congress. So Adam Kinzinger is one of these people who has requested not only additional security in his Washington, D.C. office, but in his Illinois office and for his family back in Illinois. So, I mean, I think this is where we are right now, where he's taken an extraordinarily brave stand to go on a national TV show and talk about, you know, creating a PAC for anti-Trump Republicans. I think we've got to see what happens with the sort of extremism that we talked about last week. I really do think that, you know, Merrick Garland, if you know anything about Merrick Garland's background, once he's confirmed as AG, he will go after these extremist groups around the country and try to break them. I have complete confidence in. He's a crime fighter, and I mean that in the positive sense of the word. So I think it's going to be a while before groups like the Proud Boys, the Three Percenters, and whatever other groups who are creating some real problems for Republicans speaking out against the former president. But I think, you know, this is what I see as the long-term solution, which is, you know, trying to restore a sense of just safety for these Republicans around the country to come back to speaking out on their principles. Now, just for a point of comparison, Adam Kinzinger's PAC. So he's put together a PAC to raise money to help pro or anti-Trump Republicans. You know, and he may raise, you know, a couple, $20–30 million. I have no idea what their goals are, but just, I don't know, the story over the weekend that President Trump has raised over $270 million in his own PAC, and he spent very little of it. He's, you know, this is what Kinzinger's fighting. He's got a former president who is still the fundraising arm of the Republican Party and will support pro-Trump Republicans in the next election cycle. You know, and no matter what the Lincoln Project or other groups do in conjunction with Kinzinger's PAC, there are a lot of people out there who are willing to reach deep into their checking accounts to support the former president and those that support the former president.
Do you think the New York tax case against Trump will end in a conviction?
You know, you're out. That's outside of my area of expertise. I do think some of the state legal suits against the former president are going to at least go to court. I mean, it looks like not only the tax issues related to all kinds of things, but also some of the defamation cases. I know that's a civil trial, but also, you know, I'm hearing a lot of things from legal minds that I think a lot about. Even that audio tape that came out in which President Trump was trying to extort the state of Georgia into finding 11,700 votes, that could be a very dangerous situation for the former president, because I think, you know, it violates at least 2 state election laws in Georgia and maybe some federal laws.
Okay, I know you have class at 11, so let's see if there are any last minute questions that anybody might have.
David, I would like to ask two things,
Okay.
sort of circling back to something you've already mentioned. All through this whole election year that we've been through, I've been anxious about redistricting and how the North Carolina elections were going to turn out on that. What is your feeling about the chance that we might get anything near a reasonable redistricting plan out of this assembly we have now? And also, you had a very provocative comment about Rubio and Ivanka Trump. I just would like for you to say, do you think that Ivanka Trump may try to run for senator or president against Rubio?
Let me go to that question first, because it is, I guess it's provocative. I think the fact that Ivanka and Jared have purchased land in Florida, not only to be near their dad, but I think the Trump children see that they are going to carry on the legacy of their father. So I think we might see, Laura Trump run in North Carolina in the 2022 election to replace Senator Burr. But I really do think she sees herself as someone who is electable. And Marco Rubio has supplicated or ingratiated himself a lot with Donald Trump, but as we all know, that's not necessarily, he's not necessarily protected his political position in Florida. So I think it's very likely that Ivanka could run and perhaps win. Florida is not North Carolina, it's not Georgia. On the second issue, I'm sorry, I just blanked on what the.
It was what your feelings, if there is any kind of a chance for us to get a reasonably decent redistricting done.
Oh, that's great. So next week, I'm just going to preview the session. So next week, we're going to focus in on state politics and policy. So we'll talk a lot about redistricting next week. Not that I'm trying to avoid the question, but I'll have my thoughts more together. The fact that Republicans did not lose seats in the 2020 legislative races leads me to believe that the quick answer is no. The only thing that has allowed the state of North Carolina to protect redistricting so far has been the courts.
Yeah.
So the fact that in 2018, we went from 10 Republicans and 3 Democrats in our congressional delegation to now 8 Republicans and 5 Democrats is that the courts forced the legislature to redraw. I mean, we have redrawn those maps essentially every 2 years since 2011. My guess is that Republican leadership wants to go right up to the line of legal redistricting and see how far they can push redistricting to protect their own. I mean, I may have different thoughts next week, but I'm not optimistic about a bill coming through the General Assembly that will create an independent, nonpartisan redistricting commission. That being said, it depends on the goodwill of the Republican leadership. I mean, they literally can. Remember, you can't veto a redistricting bill. So Governor Cooper has, other than the bully pulpit, has very little influence over redistricting. So you're relying on the goodwill of Republicans to draw districts that could endanger their own members.
So I guess that's definitely a no.
Well, right now it is. I mean, I change my mind oftentimes, so maybe next week I'll have a different answer, but I don't see it right now. I want to thank you all for coming out again today. So I will see hopefully all of you, but many of you next week. And thank you, Hillary, for organizing this.
Thank you, David. Thanks, everyone. Have a good week, and we'll see you next week.
Yeah, thanks, Hillary. Thanks, David.